our Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Hello and welcome to the WITA Zoom room. If you'll just give us a moment to let everyone load into the session, we'll get started momentarily. Hello from Washington, D.C., and welcome to WITA. We are delighted to have you join us today for our joint event with the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington University. Before we get to today's event, a few notes about upcoming WITA programming, which my colleague Diego Añez will post in the chat. Next Tuesday, November 9th, we'll be welcoming Ambassador Frank Lavin back to the WITA stage to discuss his new book, The Smart Business Guide to China E-Commerce. On Thursday, November 18th, also in partnership with GW, we'll be holding an event to preview the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference. That event will feature Alan Wolf, the former Deputy Director General of the WTO, among others. Then on Thursday, December 9th, we'll have a very special multi-part event looking back on the 20th anniversary of China joining the WTO. We'll be co-hosting that with our dear friend Wendy Cutler and the Asia Society Policy Institute. And we want you all to mark your calendars for the 2022 Washington International Trade Conference, which will be fully online, but also have in-person components on January 31st and February 1st. Information on all these events is in the chat, as well as on our website, www.wita.org. If you have been to any of our webinars before, you know that we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with, even if you can't see them on the Zoom. So today, with registrations coming in from over 20 different countries, a welcome to Esti Elan Kovo at the Ministry of Economy and Industry in Israel, Kazu Onishi at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan, Teresa Carpenter at the University of Sussex, Bai Shen at the World Trade Center in Shenyang, and Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky, the former United States Trade Representative. Welcome, Esti, Kazuyoshi, Teresa, Bai, and Charlene, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can during the event. You should have also received a copy of today's program by email. Should have come a little while ago, and so I'll dispense with lengthy introductions, but I would like to offer a warm online welcome to our guests, starting with our dear friend, Ambassador Tim Groser. Many of you know Tim from his time as New Zealand's ambassador to the United States, or as the former trade minister and ambassador to the WTO for New Zealand. Welcome back, Tim. Welcome as well to Shankar Singham. I first met Shankar when we hosted him at an in-person WITA event in 2018, looking at what UK trade policy might look like following the Brexit. And we're delighted to have him back today to talk about the UK joining CPTPP. Welcome back, Shankar. Welcome back as well to one of our favorite guests and a frequent partner at WITA, Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society Policy Institute and one of the original negotiators of the TPP. Welcome back, Wendy. And we're delighted today to partner with the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington University for today's event, and to welcome Jay Shambaugh, the director of the Institute and professor of economics and international affairs. Today, Jay will be moderating today's event. Jay?
Great. Thanks very much, Ken. So again, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending where it is you are right now. As Ken said, my name is Jay Shambaugh. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at GW, and I'd also like to welcome you virtually to Washington, D.C. We at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event on our Pitcairn Island, UK, and China and Taiwan really joining CPTPP as part of our series of events on rethinking about trade policy, and to once again be partnering with our co-sponsor here, the Washington Area Trade Association. So IIP, for those of you who don't know us, is located at the Elliott School at GW. It's a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. We serve to aim as a catalyst for high-quality multidisciplinary research around areas touching economic globalization, whether that's trade, finance, climate, poverty, or many, many other topics. We've been very busy at IAP lately with a number of events, including a couple more trade events coming up on November 18th. So please take a look at our website to see future events and details. I'd also like to acknowledge the IAP Executive Circle for their support and welcome to any members in attendance. Without further ado, I'd like to jump into today's topic. So towards the end of the first decade of this century, a number of countries began discussing a trade partnership across Asia, and that eventually culminated in the signing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2016. The United States withdrew in 2017, and the CPTPP was formed officially in 2018. And today, what we want to talk about is the possibility of other countries could actually seek to join that agreement. Over the last few months, there have been mentions from China or the UK, a number of countries kind of thinking, well, what would it mean if these countries were to join this agreement? We have a wonderful group to discuss this. Ken has introduced them already, and we've got their bios in material you've already gotten. So I'll just jump in with some questions. So I wanted to start, Wendy, with you as someone who was kind of there on the ground floor of negotiating TPP. How hard is it to negotiate something like this? Obviously, it took years. And I'm curious if you could just speak to some of the challenges that you run into, and in particular, kind of the gives and takes across countries, and so what it would mean if, as a new country enters the fray.
Well, first, thanks to WITA. Good to see you, Jay. Good to see you, Shankar. And it's a real honor to be sharing the stage with really the architect of TPP, Ambassador Tim Groser. So, well, I'm going to attempt to answer the questions put to me. I really look forward to hearing his wisdom. In terms of negotiating a multi-party agreement, it's complex. And in many ways, it's like a chess game that's being played in your head every night, every morning, every day at the negotiating table. There are lots of issues on the table, some tough, some technical, some that can be resolved at a working level, others that, are going to go to the last minute of the negotiation. And then there are lots of different partners at the table. And, some partners are partners with you on certain issues, while on other issues, they're going to fight you tooth and nail. So you're constantly thinking about how to build coalitions, how to achieve your objectives. And, being with the United States delegation and being in the leadership position through many, important stages of the TPP negotiations, it was always on our mind, how are we going to narrow the differences between other countries, because if those differences aren't narrowed, this deal isn't going to come together. And just to set the stage for accession negotiations, those are very different than entering a negotiation from the get-go, because when you're acceding to an agreement, you're expected basically to agree to what's on the table. Certainly some exceptions, some adjustments are allowed, and I'm sure we're going to get into that in the discussion, over the next hour. But the whole premise behind agreements that have accession procedures is to invite others into the agreement, but with the expectation that they're going to be ready to sign on to what the others have already agreed to.
Ambassador Groser, I wanted to turn to you then and just ask, as a country that is in TPP, how you view I should say, in CPTPP, the existing countries in that agreement, how they view accession and how they view the possibility of having other countries join if, as we just heard Wendy discuss, it's this very delicate dance to get to agreement amongst the members that are there. How hard is it to think about bringing someone else in?
Well, two countries have already decided to bring the United Kingdom into it. That's the real subtext of the Australia-UK FTA Statement of Principles and the copycat version for New Zealand. So I like to often quote something Arthur Dunkel, the former Director General, taught me as a young negotiator, which is read every trade agreement backwards. Don't worry about the grand language on objectives and vision, etc. Go to the footnotes of the annexes. That's where the crucial deals lie, and how wise that advice was. So the very last paragraph of the annex of the agreed principles, which I doubt either Boris Johnson or my Prime Minister ever read, is a statement that says we will not seek further trade concessions from the United Kingdom. It's part of their entry into CPTPP, which I'm now going to refer to as TPP to make it easier. So there's a political deal there. This is a major change, in my opinion. So the answer to your question, Jay, is, in my opinion, 2 members have already decided to work to get the United Kingdom into what up to now has had a regional focus. And I think it's extremely interesting, because this transforms a regional agreement, okay, with a very elastic definition of either the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, into potentially a different system of global trade rules. And one thing we might want to discuss later when we've dealt with the immediate questions is, what does that portend for the WTO?
Thank you. And yes, that's a question I very much have on my list, is what that means. Shankar, I'd like to bring you in and just think about how you see expansion of TPP from the UK side, and is how helpful do you think it is to the UK to join an agreement like this, or how important is it?
Let me just get off mute there. No, it's a very, very interesting discussion, and I'd just like to sort of build on Ambassador Groser's comments there, because clearly it has been in the UK's mind for some time that TPP, I'll follow his lead and call it TPP for ease. TPP accession for the UK has been a critical part of their overall independent trade policy. So, we're doing bilateral agreements with a number of countries. He mentioned the 2 agreements that in principle have been concluded with Australia and New Zealand. And that's very much from a UK perspective, a stepping stone to lock in the schedule negotiations. And as he referred, the UK is not really willing to have sort of multiple bites at the apple in their schedule negotiations on tariffs. So we've got the deal with Australia and New Zealand. And I would also say we also have a deal with Japan that is more than just the rollover of the existing EU-Japan agreement. It includes, other things, particularly on data and digital, that are well beyond the EU agreement. And certainly the UK has had strong support from the Japanese as well as the Australians and New Zealanders on its TPP ambitions. And so the Accession group has been set up. I think the critical thing for the TPP members was to ensure that the UK did in fact have domestic regulatory autonomy, so that it could in fact accede to the TPP, which it does have now. And partly that's the discussion that occurred in 2018 to 2020 about the UK having a free trade agreement with the EU, as opposed to any other kind of arrangement that would have limited its regulatory autonomy. And I think from a UK perspective, they're very much looking at the TPP as a gold standard kind of trade agreement, not so much because of the region, although the region is important to the UK. The Joint Strategic Review, talked about an Indo-Pacific tilt. I mean, they're very much focused on this region of the world, but they're much more interested, I think, in the level of liberalization in the TPP, and also the approach to regulatory, but particularly the basis of interaction between different regulatory systems on the basis of equivalence and mutual recognition, which is very much the Australian, New Zealand, and TPP kind of methodology, as opposed to what they've been used to in the EU, which was much more of a regulatory harmonization kind of approach externally. So those are the reasons I think the UK is interested in TPP, and it's not so dissimilar from. Obviously, we're in a different time period, but when Mexico initially joined the NAFTA, part of the reason that Mexico joined the US-Canada agreement was to lock in domestic reform in Mexico. And I think some of what's going on in the UK mind is the locking in of that reform, because obviously it's a sort of unique time for the UK. They've got to sort of decide what country they want to be. And where are they going to be on things like SPS rules in agriculture, on standards, on TBT issues? The advantage of CPTPP is it locks you into a pretty high standard and pretty WTO plus set of disciplines in those areas, which I think the UK is anxious to join. Now, they don't see this as an either or with respect to the WTO. They very much are very committed to the multilateral trading system, but at the same time, there is a recognition that liberalisation, particularly in areas that are of great interest to the UK, like services, disciplines on state-owned enterprises, disciplines on market distortions, where actually the UK, I think, is going to become quite a major force, I think, and hope there. The WTO is very far away from a lot of those issues, and the TPP is probably the most advanced, agreement in that area, and that's one of the reasons they're anxious to join it.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Groser, you wanted to hop in.
Yeah, I just want to build on Shankar's comments, and I should make it clear that I'm, having spent the first 10 years of my life in the UK, I'm a dual citizen of Britain and New Zealand. Going beyond trade, there's a very interesting implication out of this decision. So the UK announcement of the new security agreement, AUKUS, between the UK, United States, and Australia, is a very significant statement for post-Brexit Britain, that it is part of this region and a major player. And although personally, as a British citizen, I wouldn't have voted for Brexit, I would have always counseled that the worst of all worlds would have been to leave the EU, get strung into a sort of second-rate citizenship with respect to the regulatory framework, the exact point that Shankar's made. The best way to make sense out of Brexit was to do a clean break, have an independent trade policy, which is far more advanced than what the European Union is capable of doing, because, as I've said on several occasions, the Australia-UK deal is quite remarkable in terms of agriculture liberalisation, and that is always the handbrake on the European Union, which has otherwise got very solid free trade credentials. But the Common Agricultural Policy, and I speak as a former chairman of the agriculture negotiations, in spite of the considerable reforms, still acts as a handbrake. But the UK, now it's out of the EU, is going now to complete free trade in agriculture. And that is a remarkable development that I think is quite surprising, having spent 50 years in the subsidy hothouse of the CAP. And I think that Britain is becoming a real player. So in a sense, although I wouldn't have voted for Brexit, it is beginning to make some real sense, both in terms of Britain's security and military posture, and now in terms of trade policy.
Jay, if I can just add too, I think from an efficiency point of view, the UK joining TPP makes a lot of sense, because when you try to individually negotiate agreement after agreement and then have to go through your domestic procedures, it takes a lot of work and resources. So they get more bang for the buck. I know they've done a lot of bilateral negotiations. It's almost daunting how many the UK has done over such a short period of time. But then they also get the benefits of being in a regional deal, and it allows them to kind of integrate more with the region as a whole versus just having kind of bilateral economic ties.
I'm curious, just while we're on this specific part of the topic, because it just came in the Q&A, and so I just wanted to flag to the audience to please go ahead and enter questions in the Q&A if you have them. But so one question is just then, so how quickly could this happen? How hard is it to bring in the UK into CPTPP? Is this something that is a multi-year process still, despite the the efficiencies of making one negotiation as opposed to 10 or 12 or so, or is this something that actually could happen faster?
I think it depends. It depends on the regulatory settings of the UK, how quickly it could happen, and particularly with respect to the tariff schedules that have been alluded to. And I think the fact that the UK has committed to, at least over a period, to completely free trade in agriculture is a huge event for a major G7 former EU member. And that certainly paves the way for a more rapid deal. Their posture with regard to regulatory, I think, also makes the deal more rapid. David Frost, in his speech to the House of Lords on domestic regulatory reform in the UK, referenced specifically gene editing, GMO, some very taboo subjects that in the EU at least, not so taboo in the rest of the world. But so the more that is the direction of travel of the UK, I think the easier and the quicker CPTPP accession becomes. And I think this was always, in fact, it's interesting that in the last session that I did in person at WITA in 2018, we outlined this kind of strategy. But it was very much a question at the time whether they would have the requisite regulatory autonomy. What would they do with that regulatory autonomy? Whether they would have a commitment to liberalization in agriculture and other areas. What would be their approach to data flow? In terms of sort of the balance between data flow and data privacy. Now, 3 years on, we have a lot more specificity on where the UK is on all of those issues, and all of them are pointing towards the kinds of domestic regulatory settings that will speed a accession process. It won't be plain sailing, but I think all the initial indications are that it would be faster rather than slower.
I mean, I would add it will also depend on how flexible the TPP countries are as well, and how demanding they'll be either as a group or individually. This is going to be their first accession negotiation. So they're really in uncharted waters. So they're going to have to kind of figure out the procedures, how to work together. How does this working group meet? How often does it meet? All that will need to kind of be explored and experimented with. But if I'm going to go out on a limb, I would say a year from now, I would think their accession negotiations would be successfully concluded. I don't think it will go beyond then.
Ambassador Groser, I'm curious, you mentioned that, 2 countries seem enthusiastic and have in fact said, they're not going to try to extract more things out from a negotiation. Do you see that as more broadly shared? As Wendy said, the real question in some sense is it's not just how willing is the UK, but how receptive is everyone else? So if you have 2 already raising their hands saying, yes, we want them in, how broad do you think that is?
Well, I don't have any real insight into and the Mexicans are thinking, and this complications via their relationship in the regional value chain. There's USMCA there. But I would expect the other countries led by the most powerful current member, Japan, will be actually very supportive of this. But it does sort of, we haven't got to have a nice big party, but of course, there is a very large question sitting out there that somebody's not in the room, and that's the United States. So, we should obviously, this is a major issue that we should be discussing today, is what is the United States going to do as China, Taipei, UK all make their moves into an agreement that was once led by the United States? Is it going to do nothing? I don't know whether you want to go down that rabbit hole now or later, Jay, but that to me is a major question, because I think that Japan, New Zealand, Australia will be looking across the Pacific as they're thinking about the UK coming in and saying, is this a segmented negotiation, or should we give the Americans a little more time to actually come to their senses?
I think that's a very interesting question that I would like to jump to. Although I did want to jump first, just because we've raised it a few times, and it's in the title for that matter, which is kind of flipping over from thinking about the UK, which, as Shankar said, is taken many steps that you could see as smoothing an entrance into something like TPP, to then thinking of the other side, which is China. So where China has said they're interested, but as we've noted already, this is back when I was in US government around the time TPP was being finalized, we said over and over and over, this is a high standards agreement. This is the gold standard agreement. Shankar referenced it as the gold standard agreement here. In terms of its reach, and is it something that we think realistically China could accede to? Could China many people thought the whole point of RCEP was to have a different agreement that was not as much the gold standard, didn't have rules on state-owned enterprises and all these other rules that TPP does. Do we think it's actually feasible for China, or is this more just for show, or at least kind of just sticking a toe in the water?
My personal view is I don't think it's likely that the TPP members, the CPTPP members, will want to water down the commitments that have already been reached in things like state-owned enterprises, good regulatory practice. I mean, these are the sort of crown jewels almost of the TPP, and you would be doing severe damage, I think, to it to try to water that down. And unless the Chinese economy is going to radically change in its structure, and the level of distortions in the Chinese economy, their effect on trade and on competition, I can't see how China could accede to it. And if anything, I think the UK process the UK will want to, that's one of the reasons it's frankly, interested in the TPP, is there's the strength of those provisions in GRP and state-owned enterprise and competition policy and so on. And I think if anything, UK accession will make it even harder for that watering down. If anyone is tempted to do that, it'll make it harder for that to occur. So I think it's quite unlikely, unless there's a significant and massive change in the Chinese structure of the Chinese economy.
Ambassador Groser?
I totally agree. I don't think there's even a remote chance of the existing members being prepared to water down the SOE provisions and the other provisions that do create some real issues for a Chinese membership of this set of trade rules. I'd say there's zero chance of that. But there's some bigger questions that I think are really interesting. The question is, what script are the Chinese following? Well, we know that it's a different script to the 1978 Deng Xiaoping script, which, summed up in that famous statement, "It is glorious to be rich," in which they committed to market reform on a step-by-step basis. We know they're moving backwards, but how far backwards? So I find it fascinating that the discussions I had the original TPP was a lovely little double act, US power with New Zealand as a secretariat or repository of the agreement. So, I was always working hand in glove with the American team for that reason. And the Chinese, because of New Zealand's special role in TPP, had several discussions with me at a political level about joining TPP. And eventually I persuaded Mike Froman that I think they're serious, and Mike eventually agreed with me. But that was the end game in an agreement that was meant to be anchored by the power of the United States. Without the United States there, this is a very, very problematic issue for us. Now, this issue on SOEs to me is really interesting, going back to my point about what script are they following? Because paradoxically, the more technocratic members of the Ministry of Commerce who were interested in this, but no political decision had been taken in Beijing to pursue this at the time, they were very interested in the SOE chapter. Not because they thought it would create difficulties and therefore they didn't like it, but exactly the opposite reason. They knew that the SOE sector is the weakest part of the Chinese economy. We can reference, I always do in this discussion, Nicholas Lardy's brilliant work on this, which points out that in 2018, 45% of Chinese exports were from private Chinese companies. 45% of Chinese exports were from foreign companies based in China, like Apple, and only 10% from SOEs. The SOEs are hopelessly inefficient. And these more technocratically minded, very senior officials, but following the old 1978 script, they wanted those disciplines. They didn't have a problem with them. They absolutely positively wanted them because they told me the WTO has run, our reform through the WTO process has run out of steam. We need some fresh external impetus. So clearly that has changed dramatically for the worse in the last 3 years. But I'm always wary of those who say nothing will change in China. I mean, I just think that's a ridiculous statement when we've seen absolutely catastrophic, huge change in China over the last 40 years. I just don't know how far backwards they're going to go.
Interesting. Wendy, do you have thoughts here?
Yeah, just a few thoughts. I think when we look at Chinese application to join the CPTPP, we shouldn't just be looking at kind of the end game, like will they succeed in acceding to the agreement? Will the negotiations successfully reach a conclusion? I think it's the front end also that's very important to focus on. I think the bid that China made was a long time coming. They've given a lot of thought to it. It was a strategic decision. It just wasn't, some people say, oh, it's just a PR move. I couldn't disagree more. I think they know exactly what they're doing. And as Tim mentioned, they've been thinking about this for many, many years. And so I think by even the establishment, for example, of a working group to formally start negotiations, that for China would be, I think they would hit a milestone there. They would become part of the TPP, albeit not a full member, but they'd be kind of brought into more meetings. When people make decisions, they'll think about China's input more. And so I think that we need to think about this as, the front end and, and not just the end game. With respect to kind of weakening the provisions, I would just turn to what Tim said at the beginning of this negotiation, the lesson he learned from Arthur Dunkel. Look at the side letters, look at the footnotes, because you don't really have to water down the commitments. If there's a real desire by TPP countries to somehow bring China in, there are ways you can, on the face of it, make the commitments look as strong as ever, but give China breaks in ways that won't be entirely obvious. And then in the third area, we're focusing, and I couldn't agree more with what Tim said about state-owned enterprises, although given the direction China's going, it's really not just state-owned enterprises anymore. It's really the role of the state now in private companies as well. But in certain areas that TPP covers, IPR, services liberalization, the investment negative list, China is moving in a market opening direction. And I noted a comment by a senior MOFCOM official just a few weeks ago, where he said that China would offer TPP countries more market access than any country so far has enjoyed through any other trade agreement with China. And so I think they're ready to put some cards on the table in a negotiation. But I think there's so many tough issues. We mentioned SOEs. I would add labor. I would add e-commerce and environment and IPR to that list of issues that are, it's just difficult to see how China could live up to that standard without major market opening and reform.
Ambassador Groser.
I just want to raise a very sensitive issue here that I haven't heard any comment on internationally, and that is the issue about, let's use the WTO word, Chinese Taipei, because it's a trade agreement, it's appropriate, coming in at the same time. First of all, this is the 21st largest economy in terms of nominal GDP. And as all of those who have worked in the WTO know, it has an independent status in the WTO because of this strange historical accident that the membership of the GATT, the foundation stone of WTO, was not countries, but customs territories. And in 99% of cases, that is one and the same thing as a country, but not in the case of China. There are 3 different WTO members that occupy the one space. But I do think there's a very delicate issue here. If the Chinese moves inevitably become incredibly complicated across multiple, both technical and political areas, what about Chinese Taipei? I'm very conservative on this. I think that the risks now going well beyond trade into the security situation, the risks of a major mistake in cross-straits relations are real. Most wars start against a background of tension and then a horrendous miscalculation by one or other party. I would be strongly opposed to any move by the existing members to expedite Chinese Taipei's entry ahead of China. In my opinion, the one China policy that all of us follow in TPP or CPTPP is a bedrock principle that is there for far more important reasons than international commerce. And I can just see people being tempted to move more quickly with Chinese Taipei because I think it would be much more manageable. They are much more a market economy than China, but I would counsel great caution there.
Interesting. There are a couple. Yeah, Shankar, please.
I just want to pick up on a couple of things there. So the first thing is, I think that there is, and Tim referred to this, there's always been a tension between what you might call the reform-minded forces within Beijing and the sort of more planning-oriented people. And I think it's fair to say that in recent past, the planners are sort of winning those battles. But I think it is important, as signals go, that the signals that are given, basically give oxygen to the reform-minded people, such as they exist now, and they might be a very small minority, but they are there in terms of direction of travel of the Chinese economy. But the big, to come back to Tim's point about the US, I mean, that is the big elephant in the room in this discussion as well, because I think if the US were in TPP, the Chinese calculus on TPP would be very different. And certainly there are other TPP members, notably Japan, that are, and it's probably one of the reasons that the Japanese were so interested in the UK acceding, was that it really was a way of perhaps convincing the Americans to go back into to TPP. So I think you can't sort of answer any of these questions without really analysing what the US is going to do and what the timescale is on the US potential, any kind of potential sort of reaccession or rejoining the TPP, and equally, I think you can see from the Biden administration that while it was sort of completely non-issue when the president came to power, there are little signals now. There are little conversations, discussions about TPP, albeit by another name, albeit with some differences, albeit renamed, whatever you want to call it. But that's not a completely off the reservation topic anymore. And I think the politics in the US will play into this as well, depending on what happens in the midterm elections next year, and pressure on the administration to do something in the trade area. And they're not so many candidates around if you want to ensure there's no race to the bottom on environment, ensure that there's no race to the bottom on labor issues. There's not so many candidates around, so I think they will turn their attention to this. And I know, of course, all the TPP members and the UK as well have half a mind on that when they conduct their own negotiations.
I want to maybe wrap up the conversation on China with one follow-up to Wendy, which is there are a couple of questions in the chat that reference either, are there any kind of exemptions that you're referenced, kind of the side agreements or the side letter type things? Are there anything that we've seen with the existing members that might lay out a path for China where you could say, well, there were some exceptions made? And one question asked specifically about Vietnam, if there were some flexibilities there that might lay out a model, at least if China were to take a number of steps kind of in the direction towards TPP that might let them eventually accede.
So two things come to mind. The first is the way the state-owned enterprise chapter is structured. And that is, there are high standard rules, and then there's an annex of exceptions. So each country negotiated exceptions to those rules. Now, for some countries, that meant they just wanted to exempt entities forever. For others, like Vietnam, there were some long transition periods, meaning, in 10 years, this entity would need to be in full compliance. And even I think there were some exceptions for just certain obligations of the SOE rules for certain entities. And so the negotiation was really twofold, for the rules, but then for the exceptions. And I remember when I was still with USTR and was having discussions with, actually when I left USTR and was having discussions with Chinese, that they were very interested in how these exceptions were negotiated. But one thing I just want to remind everyone with respect to Vietnam is that when we were negotiating TPP, Vietnam was embarking on a campaign to privatize their entities, their state-owned enterprises. So I think Schenker said earlier how these trade agreements are, good ways to lock in, external pressure to lock in reforms. So they were moving in the right direction, I think, which made people more comfortable giving them transitions. So I think it's a different situation with China now, where not only do we, they're not privatizing the SOEs. If anything, the role of the state is expanding. And just one other exception that comes to mind that was made for Vietnam after the United States left, and that was with respect to the e-commerce chapter and treatment of data and some of those provisions. And I believe there was a side letter which basically allowed Vietnam to grandfather in, and I forget the name of the law, like the cybersecurity law, which basically said that, they could implement that law even if it was inconsistent with some of the provisions. So again, creative negotiators, if they want to give countries breaks, they can do this in a way that where the rules are kept intact, but through side letters and footnotes and annexes, they can find ways to kind of adjust the de facto strength of the obligation for a member or a candidate country.
Yes, Ambassador Groser.
Just to emphasize Wendy's point, never underestimate the conservatism of trade negotiators to preserve the existing acquis. I'll give you a simple example. New Zealand made a ridiculous decision at the end of the Uruguay round, and I can say that because I was the chief negotiator, but I had nothing to do with this particular ridiculous decision not to join the government procurement code. And then actually for crazy reasons, which I won't go into. When we changed our mind, when I was trade minister and tried to join, you have no idea how many difficulties the existing members of the GPA had with what would have not raised a second of consideration had we joined at the beginning. So, there's just like a human natural tendency to look at a new guy coming into an existing agreement with a tooth comb that is quite extraordinary. And I'm certain that dynamic will play. If we are looking at just simply the existing acquis, to use the European Union concept, and locking in the UK, locking in China, locking in whoever to it. But I think it raises the point that Shankar raised. Is that really the game we're looking at? Because if the United States does shift its policy over the next year to 2 years, I don't think that is the game. We're looking at a new agreement, and we're looking at preserving all the bits that, and a large part of TPP is still hugely influenced by US thinking, and it would be completely valid. But I think we're looking at a complete upgrade to the existing TPP agreement if the United States comes in. Otherwise, we're looking at a deeply conservative position of other people just docking into the existing battleship.
Yeah, Shankar.
Yeah, and the key word I think Tim used there was upgrade. And if you look at the direction of travel of what might be that sort of upgrade, and you look at a potential China accession, I mean, there are lots of examples, as Wendy's outlined. And one example was when Chile came in, they got an agricultural, a bit of a carve out, a bit of a transition period. But they were mostly a pretty open economy and a pretty market-based economy. If the number of exceptions you'd require across the field in terms of not just state-owned enterprises, but labor, environment, all of these rules, and if you look at the dispute settlement provisions of the TPP in those areas, they're quite advanced in terms of giving third parties the ability to ensure that a country is complying with its own law and its own legal commitments. under the agreement. The question would be how big would that body of exception be, and would that sort of defeat the purpose of the agreement? And if the US were to come in according to that kind of timescale, then there's certainly not going to be any watering down of labour and environmental provisions, and I think that would raise an even more of an issue and a challenge for China there.
You know, I want to maybe pivot away from the conversation around specific countries acceding and come back to something I believe, Ambassador Groser, you raised it quickly, which is this question of, if one thinks about TPP originally, even, it was already only very loosely a regional agreement, right? I mean, yes, technically almost every country touched the Pacific in some way, but it was still countries in North America, South America, Oceania, Asia. Adding the UK, while technically, as the title of this event jokingly points out, there are islands of the UK in the Pacific, but setting those aside, it would mean this is no longer even plausibly by any stretch a regional agreement. And I'm curious what each of you just think about what that means, both not just for this agreement, but what it means for multilateralism more broadly, or for the WTO, if countries are starting to stretch agreements that are no longer even reasonably regional to just form agreements of groups of countries that are willing to take on certain obligations and just in some sense leave the WTO behind. Wendy,
In short, I mean, I think that's where we're headed. I think if you're waiting for the WTO to define the rules and update the rules for the global trading system, you're going to be waiting a long, long time and maybe forever. And so it's just natural that countries will look for coalitions, either regionally, on a geographic basis, on an issue by issue basis. I think we're just going to be seeing more and more of that going forward. And just the way that the WTO no longer is conducting large multilateral trading rounds, which was their defining negotiating technique for many, many years, I think even comprehensive free trade agreements are going to become more and more difficult for countries to negotiate. I think one of the big challenges looking ahead is just the fast pace of technological advancements and the slow pace of negotiating and putting these deals into force. And I think looking ahead, the negotiating model we have may just need to be really rethought. And, the notion of just very binding, enforceable, comprehensive agreements may no longer be suitable for the challenges that are going to be facing the multilateral trading system.
Yes, Ambassador Groser. Sorry, you're on mute.
My first job was actually a professional actor because my parents were both professional actors and I was a child actor. And I remember playing the lead part in Samuel Beckett's famous play, Waiting for Godot. And the important thing is, of course, Godot never arrives. So I see this as waiting for the WTO. Is this a rehash of Samuel Beckett's play? Now, I don't know what the answer is, but I think this process of transforming, I totally agree with you all saying that it was only very thinly a regional agreement, but the UK coming into it strips that pretense away completely and therefore opens the gateway to other countries, which we do not think of as part of the natural footprint of the Asia Pacific coming in too. Now, I think this can play two ways. One is in the way which I don't think any of us want. And I absolutely mean that. I think all of us actually would much prefer a reinvigorated multilateral trading system. There's no doubt about that in my view. But this will evolve into an alternative WTO, or it will have exactly the opposite effect. It will finally spur particularly Brussels to actually sit down seriously with the Americans and the Japanese, expand that trilateral dialogue that's been going on at a relatively low level over subsidies in particular, into a much more broad-based set of discussions. What do we need to reverse engineer back into the WTO to make it work? So I don't know which way it's going to go, but I think those are two, in a sense, both of those possibilities. Plan A would be the WTO actually comes to grip with its internal problems and gets its mojo back. Or plan B is that slowly we're creating a different system of international trade rules to deal with problems that the WTO hasn't dealt with since 1994. Either of those will be assisted by this expansion of TPP.
Yeah, and I think we have to remember, and of course, Tim and Wendy were sort of present at the creation, that one of the reasons TPP exists is because of a lack of progress in the WTO and a desire by countries like New Zealand and Singapore and also the US to have some kind of more meaningful liberalization and a sort of coalition of a willing group of countries to actually, who were committed to essentially a liberalized trading system and competition on the merits as an organizing economic principle and property rights protection. And I think as we go forward with this, I agree that either this is going to challenge the WTO into action, or nothing will challenge the WTO. There's another element to all of this, and Tim referred to AUKUS. AUKUS is far more than just a submarine agreement. It provides a sort of container for a number of potential things in the area of international economic policy, including dealing, properly with behind the border market distortions, what I've called anti-competitive market distortions. You've also got the Atlantic Charter that was just agreed in the G7 between the US and the UK, where similar views prevail on market distortions. The work of the trilateral group, EU, US, Japan, on this topic has been quite disappointing. I think initially it was, very much welcomed, but it has been, it hasn't been as successful a project as it might have been. And I think what you'll see is other vehicles, other receptacles for this kind of thinking, like AUKUS, being used. And I think one of the things that the Australians, the Americans, and the UK will want to do is with AUKUS is to challenge the Japanese and put some pressure on the Japanese to step up to the plate, not just in the trade agenda, but in the wider foreign policy and security agenda as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of the context for this discussion. And I don't think anything's going to stop the desire of countries who need further and deeper liberalization and who need solutions to global distortions and market distortions to continue down that path. We all hope that the WTO will respond to this by, as Tim said, getting its mojo back, but by actually dealing with these issues. We don't know that, and we have no way of knowing, how that will play out. But I don't see any pulling back on some of these arrangements. In fact, I think if anything, there's going to be an acceleration of them.
I want to actually come back to one thing Wendy said, and first give Wendy you an opportunity to either expand or correct what I'm about to characterize as your view. But because we've had some mention here of, maybe this will stimulate the WTO to get its mojo back, or alternatively, maybe TPP will, in some sense, be the venue that a lot of trade negotiation is taking place. But you flag kind of a different possibility, right? Which is maybe these big comprehensive agreements are just too unwieldy these days for the speed of what's going on. And it made me think of kind of the agreement on corporate taxation that just took place, where that was not a big comprehensive multi-issue across 30 stakeholders across. It was just, okay, the countries that needed to be in the room came to an agreement on something that was important, and that's a finite decision. And I'm curious if we think that is possibly where this goes, if we don't see a pickup at the WTO, or is it really these regional, or what are kind of only pretending to be regional agreements as a future?
Well, I would say it's happening in the trade world. You just have to look at the plurilaterals in the WTO or, the regional digital agreement. And we haven't even had time to get into, but I thought it was very interesting. Just 48 hours ago, China now has expressed interest in joining one of the premier regional digital agreements, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, championed by New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore. Just put that on the table. So I think that's happening already. Two words of caution. I mean, we need multilateral trading rules. So I'm not advocating we scrap the WTO, but I think we need just to recognize its limits. And also, negotiating single issue agreements, it's tough, because your ability for trade-offs are limited. And that was one of the beauties of working on trade rounds or FTAs, that countries were demanders in certain areas, and that made them more willing to make concessions in other areas. If it's a one-issue negotiation, for certain countries that you really want them to join because you want them to follow those rules, they sometimes don't see, their question is, what's in it for them?
Interesting. Ambassador Groser or Shankar, any thoughts on, do we devolve to more single issue, or will, especially as we think about the UK's approach here, which seems to be trying to get into a much larger agreement, or will it be that that's hard and that it just has to happen individually?
I mean, I think it's always going to be hard to do that on a single issue basis, and even the UK, which has come a long way since I last spoke at WITA in 2018 on its trade policy, has come an awfully long way on agricultural liberalisation, for example. It's an ongoing battle. It doesn't get solved, overnight, and then you move on to the next thing. There'll be a challenge from publics and from vested interest groups and groups that have totally legitimate interests in protecting themselves, that will continue to be the backdrop of any negotiation. So I don't think we're going to devolve into that kind of world. Where I do think you will see much more emphasis, and in a sense, things like CPTPP and other sort of plurilateral arrangements, whether they're external to the WTO, or whether they are WTO plurilateral agreements, you are going to see a lot more of that type of thing. But I think the role of the comprehensive trade agreement is certainly not over. And I don't think the Australia and New Zealand deals that the UK just concluded would have been possible on a single issue basis, and they are vital to the UK's TPP accession. So I think we'll continue to do those kinds of arrangements.
Ambassador Groser.
A couple of points. First of all, again, I'm in violent agreement with everyone here. There's no question that Shankar's judgment is correct. The extraordinary ambition of the two first genuine comprehensive FTAs that the UK, which is the 6th largest economy in the world, have done, is comprehensible politically only in the context of a British strategy to get into the bigger agreement. So I don't think these things are strict alternatives. It's not a binary choice. We will see further plurilateral agreements, as Wendy has pointed out. And we still have got to be very careful with the WTO. I think the percentage of global trade that is covered by WTO provisions is about 70% of global trade. I mean, all China-US trade is essentially based on WTO system. All EU-US trade is based on the WTO. So I know some people think that people like me and Wendy, who have been at the forefront of promoting TPP and other regional agreements, are losing interest in the WTO. It's complete nonsense. We're not. It's just that we are aware of the massive amount of work that needs to be done and the slowness of the WTO to respond. But none of us have given up on the WTO. It's still there, always in the back of our minds, as to we need a world trading system.
I think we've just hit the 4 o'clock hour, and that last comment may be the perfect comment to end on. And so unless Wendy or Shankar had any last closing thought, I'll turn it back over to Ken.
Thank you, Jay, Shankar, Wendy, Tim. Really fantastic conversation, really illuminating, super important discussion and timely. Thank you all very much. When I did the shout outs of people who were watching online, I went around the world, and I mentioned at the end Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky is on. I also noticed Ambassador Carla Hills, another former U.S. trade representative, is also logged into today's session. So welcome, Carla, as well. Thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Jay, look forward to partnering in future events. Wendy, as well. Other events we have in the pipeline with both of you. Tim, great to see you again, and hope to have you back on the WITA platform. Thank you for coming to us from Thursday in New Zealand. And Shankar, great to see you again as well. Thanks everybody for watching. Take care, be well, and make sure you get the shot wherever you're located or wherever you are. If